thank you very much for joining us this evening for this wonderfully exciting event with Vikram Singh Mehta. I'm here from the business school, so a very warm welcome to you all to our fairly new building. I've been working here for the last 9 months as the internationalisation manager, where I'm helping this business school to establish broad-based partnerships with other world-leading business schools. So this is exactly the kind of event we like to host here at the business school. It's international, it's discussing a very current theme, just fresh from the Indian elections. So it's incredibly timely that we're hosting this kind of event, and we're delighted to be doing so in tandem with Asia Scotland Institute. So without further ado, I'll pass you over to Roddy. Thank you.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much indeed for allowing us to be here back at the business school, which as chairman of the Asia Scotland Institute has come to be very much our home. We started the Asia Scotland Institute in March of 2012 and launched that year in the Playfair Library of the university with a mission, for those of you that don't know this, to really build bridges between Scotland and Asia, and to do so through increasing people's understanding of this great region defined as extending from Syria in the west all the way to Japan in the east. And we do this through programs such as this that focus on arts, culture and education, policy and politics, and business and economics. And for some of you who've been to our talks already, you will know that a number of leading business figures have been and spoken with us. Xavier Rowley, the Chief Executive of the London Stock Exchange Group, Dominic Barton, the Global Head of McKinsey, Lord Stephen Green when he was Minister for Trade, talking about how we should engage with the ASEAN countries and a number of others. And today it's at a very topical, critical moment really. It's our immense pleasure to welcome Vikram Singh Mehta, who is not only a great friend, but also an ideal person to lead us through an analysis of what has been going on in the largest democracy in the world in its recent growth. It's important to acknowledge, I guess, two companies, particularly Leapfrog Investments, who are here. Stuart, good to see you, and some of his colleagues who are making this possible, and also Virgin Atlantic, who actually got Vikram here from London, because before that he travelled to India by way of Dubai, where, working with McKinsey, he was talking about his contribution to McKinsey's study called Reimagining India, which for those of you who haven't read it, I think you can probably find it on the web, but it's a fascinating analysis and study of modern India. So I'd just like to say a few words by way of introduction. As you know, India's new Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, has vowed to accelerate economic growth and promised Indians that good times are coming. And the presentation that Vikram is kindly going to give you is going to focus on, as I've said, the results of this election. The election was held to constitute the 16th Lok Sabha, electing members for all 543 parliamentary constituencies. And according to the Election Commission of India, 814.5 million people were eligible to vote, with an increase of 100 million voters since the last general election in 2009. So if you think that the returning officers in some of the constituencies of the United Kingdom have a difficult time, I have no sympathy for them at all. These are huge, huge numbers. So this was the largest ever election in the world. And around 23.1 million, or 2.7% of the total eligible voters, were aged between 18 and 19. And a total of 8,251 candidates contested for the 543 seats. And there was a quite remarkable turnout of 66, I think, 0.38%, the highest ever in the history of the Indian general elections. Now let me tell you just a little bit about Vikram before we start. His ancestors were Divans of Udaipur. His grandfather was India's High Commissioner to Pakistan. His father was Foreign Secretary. So public service, it seemed, was a legacy handed down to Vikram by generations. And a legacy he almost pursued when he joined the Indian Administrative Services, only to leave a couple of years later and was on his way to join the World Bank when a call from Shell offered him the prospect of working for that great multinational oil and gas company's division in Egypt. To quote something that he said, "My interest," he said, "was already in petroleum, and I wasn't too keen on the World Bank job. Shell is a great company, so I took the risk and it worked out." Well, it certainly worked out extraordinarily well for him. He ended up running Shell in India. He was its executive chairman and really was responsible for Shell during a quite extraordinary period of economic growth and then latterly stagnation, as we shall see. He was awarded the Asia House's Businessman of the Year in 2010 when I was privileged to be involved with my wife April in making that happen. The two other awardees were Jack Ma of Alibaba and Lord Stephen Green, of whom I've spoken. And to show what good company he was in, the following year, in 2011, the same award was given to Ratan Tata of the Tata Group. So having been with Shell for nearly 2 decades, Vikram stepped down. Today he is the executive chairman of the Indian division of Brookings, an extremely famous and well-known think tank and institution in Washington, with whose scholars we work very closely here. And he is also on the board of Diageo in India. Interestingly, when in his education he was up at Oxford, he was there at the same time as Imran Khan and Benazir Bhutto. So I can't think of anybody better qualified to talk about the broad sort of swath of things that have been going on within India and to give us a detailed analysis of the, in many ways, quite extraordinary demise for the moment of the Congress Party and rise of the BJP. So the way we're going to work is that Vikram has very kindly agreed to talk for 20 minutes. We'll then have Q&A, probably for 20 minutes or so after that, and then we'll repair outside for libations and eats, for which we're very grateful again to the business school. So, Vikram, thank you. The floor is yours.
Well, Roddy, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to this beautiful city. Thank you for that very generous introduction. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to address all of you. You know, this subject, BJP's landslide, a seismic change, or more of the same. And that's a great topic. It actually can be answered very simply. It's neither. It's not a seismic change, nor is it going to be more of the same. And the reason is, I think, pretty clear. India is not a country that allows for seismic changes. It's not a country that allows for a radical shift. It's a country that is plural, diverse. It's one where there are several axes of conflicts and contention, the axis of religion. It's a predominantly Hindu nation, as you know, but there are 150 million Muslims. The axis of language. There are 22 languages that have been accepted by the Constitution of India, but there are 300 dialects. The axis of caste. There are 4 major castes that we all talk about, but there are 3,000 subcastes, and people define who they associate with, who they fight with, whom they marry on the basis of caste. The axis of class. It's a hugely diverse, economically diverse country, and money it's an unequal country. And now you might even add a 5th axis, the axis in some senses of gender. India is a patriarchal society, but and women have never been treated with respect, notwithstanding the fact that we have had a prime minister who is a woman, notwithstanding the fact that for the last 10 years, Sonia Gandhi has been the dominant power in the country. So, you know, the challenge for Indians has been to develop a unifying narrative, to develop a theme around which they can build a consensus. And that challenge has not yet been overcome. And it is until such time as we overcome that challenge, we will not be able to see a seismic change. What we will see and what we could hope for are shifts of the needle a few degrees. So the issue today, as we contemplate the consequences or the ramifications of this extraordinary result, and I'll talk a bit more about that, is what is going to be the drivers of that change? How far will this needle shift? How quickly will that needle shift? What will be the impact of these elections on economic policy? So let's not talk about a radical change. Let's not talk about a seismic change. Let's talk about the fact that there's going to be an incremental change. And let's talk about the pace of that incrementalism. That's the question that we have to address. It is certainly not going to be more of the same, though. And I'll talk more about that than perhaps the first point. These elections represent a major discontinuity from the past. There is no more. I cannot see this being a situation where the past is going to determine the present or indeed the future. The fact of the matter is that at one level, these elections have suggested a radical change in our politics. But at another level, it also shows that our politics are, in fact, still pegged along those axes of caste, class, religion, and language. The BJP won 38% of the votes. They secured 38% of the votes that were polled. So as Roddy said, there were 800 million people who had the right to vote, and 66% or so of them voted. BJP and its allies secured 38% of those votes. The Congress and its allies received 20%, and the balance was spread between the various regional parties. So we must keep in mind the fact that 62% of the country, of those who voted, still voted for a political party that was not the BJP. All right? The second very important point to keep in mind is that the BJP's votes were predominantly in North India, Maharashtra, Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, and these smaller states. So of the 282 seats that the BJP won out of a parliament of 543, 211 seats were from this area. And the balance of the seats didn't go to the Congress. They went to the regional parties. The Congress only received 144 seats, the lowest that they've ever won. 44 seats in Parliament, in a Parliament of 543. So you have 282 seats with the BJP, you have 44 seats with the Congress. The rest is with regional parties. So there's been a rebalancing. The radical change, if we talk about radical or seismic change in politics, the radical or seismic change in politics today is the rebalancing of the position between the two mainstream political parties in India, the Congress and the BJP. It is not a rebalancing of the position of the regional parties, the parties whose support base are limited to individual states. So Tamil Nadu, for instance, is held by a local leader, the DMK or AIDMK. The leader of that swept the polls. She, I think, won 36 of the 37 seats. I may have got it wrong, actually, 33. Orissa, West Bengal, Andhra, all of them are regional parties. So you have a situation where the Hindi belt, which is this, has been actually secured by the BJP. And the regional parties have been successful in retaining their hold over the rest of India. Now, what does it really signify? And what is the significance of these political shifts? The significance of it is that India is today in the middle, I wouldn't say facing, the middle of a conflict between society and state. Society today, as represented by the 450 odd million people below the age of 25, is a vibrant society. It's a dynamic society. It's an entrepreneurial society. It's a society where the traditional language of that determined relationships relating to pegged on age or hierarchy or religion has been overturned. It's a society that's looking forward to a better future rather than a better mosque or a better temple. It's a society that is impatient with the past. The last time that a political party won a majority in parliament was in 1984. And at that time, the reason they won a majority, the Congress, was because Mrs. Gandhi had been assassinated and the electorate were in a sense cleaving to the past. Today, the BJP has won a majority because the people are looking to the future. That's a very significant shift. Now, this society is actually in direct clash with a state that has for the last 3 years come across as cautious, as hesitant, a state that's still rooted in the past, a state that's unable to actually recognize the changes that are taking place around the world. There's this clash that today is you might say endemic, is pervasive in our country, and you see it at every level. You see it at the level at the level of urbanization. You see today 100 million people are moving into cities. By 2017, we will have 300 million people living in cities. By 2025, I'm told 650 million people. Urbanization is a trend that will again homogenize our society. It will weaken these axes that I talked about, because people in cities have left behind their traditional affiliations. They've left behind those networks, those relationships that defined their identity in the past, in their homes. They're now in cities which does not recognize your caste. It does not recognize your religion. It only recognizes, in some senses, growth, economic growth. So there we have this is a phenomena that I think is one that Modi recognized and tapped into very effectively. He gave, I think the figure is 550 speeches over a 3-month period. Not one speech focused on religion. Not one speech asked for votes on the basis of caste. All his speeches talked about development. And the voters have voted this time on the agenda of development. UP, which is a state that is horrendously riven by caste, has been completely swept by the BJP. And the regional parties there, who are caste-based parties, is a party that is representing the lower castes, there's a party that represents what we call the other backward classes, there's a party that represents the upper caste. All of them have been wiped out. This is what's so radical about this election. So the question that now we have to ask is, what is going to be Modi's economic agenda Is he going to be able to meet the expectations of this electorate, this young, aspirational, entrepreneurial electorate? This is a very difficult question to answer, and I'll tell you why it's difficult. It's difficult because whatever be the outcome of the elections, we cannot sweep under the carpet the fact that India faces deep, deep problems. 300 million people still live below the poverty line. 1 in 5 Indians do not have access to healthy sanitation. 48% of our people only are literate. There is a mortality rate of 40 for 10,000, 40 per 10,000 live births. That's the infant mortality rate. As contrast, and this is 3 times that in China. There is a huge gap, a huge shortage of basic health services. There is a shortage of nurses, there's a shortage of doctors. Teachers don't attend classes. I can go on and on. The infrastructure of India, it's abysmal. So, what is it? We can't just solve the energy crisis, the thing that I'm familiar with. 400 million people do not have access to energy. And 300 million more have access, but only for 4 hours a day. So here is a country that has major structural problems. No one is going to be able to solve those problems overnight. No one's going to be able to solve them in his tenure in government. And here's a prime minister who's made it very clear up front that he wants to be prime minister for 10 years. He wants to be re-elected. And he knows full well that he cannot be re-elected if he does not meet the aspirations of the people who voted for him. And the people who voted are those 100 million odd people between the age of 18 to 23 or 24 who are first-time voters. They are the ones that actually voted him back to power. If they don't get a job, if they find that the economic opportunities that are created by this government are those that they themselves cannot harness or they themselves cannot access, there's going to be a backlash. So there's a challenge here. Now, why am I optimistic, notwithstanding all of what I've said, that this government, this man is going to take the right steps? I'm not saying he'll solve the problem. I'm not saying that he won't have challenges. I am saying that I am optimistic that he will be he will be re-elected. Optimistic, okay? I'm not predicting. The reason for optimism about the future, and there are several, but this is the first, is that the slide in the growth rate of the economy was not because of the structural inadequacies or the structural impediments facing the economy. It was also not because of the international environment. It was not because the world outside had gone into recession. It was because of bad economic policy. And bad economic policy can be reversed. Yeah? So, Manmohan Singh was one of the great economists of our country, actually was a bad economic manager over the last 3 years. The financial position of the country today is bleak or is dire. Modi has inherited a very weak position because of the fiscal populism of the previous government. This is one reason why inflation today is at 8 to 9%. It is over the last 3 years is the one country where they deliberately did nothing to prevent the appreciation of the rupee. As a result of that, our export industry went into a dive. The last government was singularly responsible for choking up the investments by the private sector in the major infrastructural industries. There are 7,000 megawatts of power plants that have been built but not yet commissioned because of lack of fuel. I mean, India has the 5th largest deposits of coal in the world. It imported 100 million tons of coal last year. Its import dependence on oil is 80% today. 25 years ago, it imported only 25% of its oil. I mean, I could just go on, but the point I'm trying to make is that these decisions made by the previous government over the last 3 years are decisions that can be reversed, and as a result of those reversals, the economy can be put back onto the trajectory of growth. So that's the first reason for degree of optimism. The second is that the fundamentals of our economy are still very strongly intact. I mean, it is still a large market, and it's a growing market. We still have a huge reservoir of technical talent. When I was chairman of Shell in India, we created a technology center in Bangalore. That center, when I left in November 2012, had 1,000 scientists, of whom about 90% were Indians. The center was so successful that Shell decided to close down all of its technology centers around the world except 3. One in Houston, one in Amsterdam, and one in Bangalore. The reason I give you this example is just to show you how capable our technological talent is. It has a very young population, as I've repeatedly said. This demographic dividend is something that we can harness. It can be a demographic disaster if they don't find jobs, but let's look at the positives. The fundamentals here are strong. So that is a second reason why I would be optimistic. A third reason for optimism is that, the solutions to our problems are known. We Indians, Amartya Sen wrote a book called The Argumentative Indian. And frankly, that's a great title, because we love to sit around and talk. And we talk, and we talk. And what do we talk about? In our drawing rooms or in conferences, we talk about the problems of India. We talk about the solutions that need to be carried out, but we never talk about how to actually implement those solutions. That is a big no-no. Why? Because we feel that actually is something we can't put our hands around. Now today, for the first time, I'm noticing that people are talking about the how. Why? Because there is a convergence here between Delhi, with its strong muscular leadership, under the leadership of Narendra Modi, and the fact that all of these states are also now run by very strong muscular leaders. Coalition government has actually been put onto the back burner. It's a phenomenon that we did not expect to see. I mean, in 1990, all of us wrote articles saying that we are now into an era of permanent coalitions. Permanent coalitions. We will never see a single party actually receive a majority. Today, that's completely, every state, except this one which is going to elections, but all of these states, the major states, are all led by one party and a strong leader. So for the first time, we can actually see a situation where there is a man or there is a group of leaders who can and who have the political mandate to deliver on the solutions that they've been talking about for so long. And that's very important. And then, so finally, before I open it up for, what is it that I see this government doing so far as foreign investors and private and investment is concerned, economic? One, I can see this government very clearly recognizing the importance of investment. We need, and here's one estimate, there could be many other estimates, $1 trillion at least to upgrade our infrastructure, roads, ports, railways. We need $1 trillion. Government of India doesn't have that. They need the money from outside. There is no shortage of cash, by the way. There's no shortage of liquidity. That's not going to be the problem. The problem is investor confidence. This investor confidence has been eroded in the past because of the government's attitude towards taxation. They retroactively taxed Shell, Vodafone, Microsoft, Nokia. The investor confidence has been eroded because of the government's approach to contracts. They have unilaterally changed contract terms. This government will, in my view, make an aggressive effort to actually address this issue of investor confidence. So that's one. Second, we have had in the past a real problem with the bureaucracy, the institutions of governance. The institutions of governance in India have been eroded. And what are those institutions? There's the legislature, which is parliament, there's the executive, which is the bureaucracy, and then there's the judiciary. The last parliament, just before we went into elections, sat for only 8% of its allocated time. That is the last session of parliament, the winter session, 8% only. The rest of the time they were fighting. They didn't allow the business of parliament to carry on. Over the 5 years of the 15th Lok Sabha, only 150 bills of the 360 bills that had been tabled were addressed. Parliament is dysfunctional, and that is something we will not see now because Parliament is now run by one party. The bureaucracy. Today, the bureaucrats in India, or at least 6 weeks ago, the bureaucrats in India did not sign a file. This was because of an act in Parliament called, or an act because of an act called the Prevention of Corruption Act. This act assumes the guilt of any bureaucrat who signs a file that then leads to a benefit for a private sector entity. So if today I sign as a bureaucrat a file that might generate some return for leapfrog investors, at some future date, the Central Vigilance Commissioner of India or the Central Bureau of Investigation of India or the Central Auditor General of India, the CBI, CVC, and CVC, CBI, and CAG, could turn around and say, Mr. Vikram Mehta, please explain why you signed this file. And I am put under suspension until the inquiry is completed. There was no way I'm going to sign that file. What I'll do is pass it on to my colleague. The act of omission was a far more preferable and more prudent course to follow for bureaucrats than the act of commission. This lacuna, this institutional flaw, this institutional weakness is also being addressed by this government. The first thing the Prime Minister has done, not the first, but amongst one of the early things, he called the 77 senior most civil servants in India and talked to them directly, without the ministers present. And the third institutional plank or pillar of governance is the judiciary. There are 32 million cases today that have not been, that are waiting to be heard. 32 million. 80% of those cases are in the lower courts of India. There are 1.2 judges for every 100,000 citizens of India. In the US, there are 10.5 judges for every 100,000. So when you take these three pillars of governance, the bureaucracy, the parliament, the bureaucracy, and the judiciary, the only pillar that the Prime Minister may not be able to address directly is the judiciary. He's already beginning to tackle the bureaucracy, and he has parliament in control. So there is reason for optimism. There is reason why the next step will be a positive step. There's reason to believe that it will not be more of the same, but that nor will it be a seismic shift, but what we are going to see is the first step in a direction, in the right direction, a step that will create a momentum for someone to take the next step, which will be a larger step, all in the same positive direction. And eventually the needle of change will move closer and closer towards that destination, towards that 360-degree circle that we're all hoping to secure or see. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not, as I said, I'm not a, I mean, I'd like to believe I'm an objective observer. I recognize that for every fact that I present to you, or every assertion that I make to you about India, there is going to be, and there can be, a very legitimate, logical counter-assertion. That's the truism. There is no one truth in India. But for whatever it's worth, I think if I had money today, if I was an investor with surplus money, I would be seriously looking at bringing money into the country now. I think you're going to see a massive change. Thank you.
Vikram, thank you. Wow, what a fascinating tour d'horizon by someone extraordinarily well informed about these markets. Now, Vikram's very kindly agreed to take questions and to do so standing up, like a good guy that he is. All I would ask you to do is two things. One, could you please say who you are, and if it's useful, where you come from. And second, could you please ask a question, which is what questions and answers are about. No question, you won't get an answer. Got it? Right. The floor is open.
Thank you for a fascinating presentation, which I'm very glad I heard. You mentioned two things which interest me. One, the axis of gender and the issue of perhaps insufficient respect to women, and the entrepreneurial culture which you feel there is in the younger demographic. So how is the position of women going to be improved? And will they be able to forge ahead in an entrepreneurial manner as men?
Can I make a suggestion? We just hold that question. Lady has a question in the front row, yes?
Yeah, well, I'm really cheeky. I actually have two questions.
All right. Well, that'll make three, and then we'll get an answer.
Jessica Field from Scottish Government. I was interested that you didn't mention the AAP and that you gave two main political frontrunners. Obviously, they were catastrophically defeated in the election, but given Kejriwal's high status as Chief Minister of Delhi and focus on anti-corruption, do you consider them a non-entity now? My second question is related to the phenomenon of Modi as a personality, and given his intent on being in there for 2 terms and the complexity of governing India as a single unit, if it doesn't work, will impetus, money and focus be put into maintaining that personality at the expense of economic development in the long run?
3 questions.
Right. 3 great questions.
Thank you.
Women, yeah. This, I think this is as I said, there are many challenges. I should have actually, when I was listing out the challenges, I should have also reiterated this, the issue of gender. You don't read the Indian papers, thank God. Every day of the last 10 days has been gruesome, reports of gruesome incidents. Gruesome. You've seen them. I mean, absolutely gruesome. Rape and hanging and so you have you ask that question, and you say, what on earth? What are we going to do about this? What can we do about this? Because this is reflective of the India that's still in the medieval age. This is the reason I say you don't see seismic change. This is the reason why I'm asking everyone to say, hold off making making these wonderful statements about the implications of an election result like this. We still have major issues. On the other hand, so there's always one, and these elections have seen the largest number of women voted into parliament. There's 65 women in parliament, right? In Udaipur, which is where I'm from, which is in Rajasthan, I'm from a state called Udaipur. I'm in Rajasthan in a city called Udaipur. My grandfather, who was already mentioned, after he left the government and a lot of other things, he set up an NGO, which is you know, now working in about 800 villages. And one of the things that this NGO does is actually it tries to train people who have been elected as village leaders. There's an act of parliament that allows now people to be elected leaders of the village. You know, and it's called Panchayati Raj. Now, 60% of the women, 60% of the leaders elected to run groups of villages are women in this area. Now, this is one of the most feudal parts of India. All this was created by combining the former princely states of India. You know, it's very feudal. And yet today, in Rajasthan, in Udaipur, you actually find that a increasing number of women are being voted by the villagers to be the leaders of that village. I'm picking on straws here, okay? But I'm just trying to say, on one hand, we are a patriarchal society. We have, especially in UP and Haryana and Bihar, we have these awful incidents because men still dictate how women should live. On the other hand, you have these broad trends that suggest that education is leading to a change in the nature of the relationship between men and women. I don't know if I mentioned that in this election where 66% of the people voted, the gender balance was the same. As many women voted as men. So how do you do it? There's all sorts of initiatives that have been, that even the last government actually, very good initiatives by the last government. Women's reservation bill, there's lots of, but the mindset of the people has to change before we can actually create a society where we really can talk about respect for women. I'm going to leave it at that because I really don't have a clear, specific answer to that, but it's a big issue. The Our Party, you know, I wrote an article. I write a monthly op-ed piece for one of our national newspapers, and I wrote one a few days after they took charge as chief minister. They took charge of the Delhi government, saying this is the biggest mistake you've made. And the reason I said that is, I'm not going to go into all of it, but I said you don't have the mandate, number one. Secondly, you don't have the experience. And thirdly, you succeeded because you provided a forum for all of us, meaning to actually protest against the corruption in this country. We didn't look to you to govern. We looked to you to provide that forum. We look to you as a forum for protest. Now that you're governing, you're going to be shown as an emperor without clothes, especially when you govern without a mandate. And that's exactly what happened in some senses. 45 days later, they collapsed. And today in the general elections, the election commissioner, the joke during the center, this is a joke, but it's just a joke which has been physically is physically manifest. And what is it? It's a certificate of appreciation from the Election Commission of India to the Our Party, saying thank you for having donated 50 lakh rupees to the Election Commission. 50 meaning 5 million rupees. Why is that? Because they set a record for having lost their deposits. Of the 500 or 450 candidates that they put up, 420 lost their deposits. In other words, they did not even get enough votes to get their deposit back. I think that's 5% of the votes, something. So the Our Party itself, in my view, is inconsequential, in my view. It'll have to reinvent itself, and it will be reinvented because those sort of groups are important. But this particular manifestation of the Our Party, I think, is not going to be a consequence. And your third question was?
About the phenomenon of the personality.
Yeah, that's, again, see, I mean, this was a presidential election. This was an election with Modi as the figure on every poster. There was no other figure on those posters. There wasn't the figure of Modi and Vajpayee, who was the former prime minister, or Modi and Advani, who was a leader of the political party called the BJP. There was only Modi. And then there was just one slogan which said, you know, let's give up, let's do away with corruption, for example. It's time for a Modi government. Now, when you translate it then to Hindi, there's a sort of a rhyme to it, okay? Let's promote education. We want a Modi government. It was that. It wasn't a BJP government, it was a Modi government. It was a strongly presidential. And so there is always this sort of question, are we headed on the pathway of democratic autocracy? You know, we have it's a democracy. It's a country that has a very liberal process, but which has, in some senses, a conservative outcome. Or you could even argue, if you were really, really worried, an illiberal outcome. You know, an outcome where you have a leader who has potentially autocratic powers. Again, I think this is reading too much into Modi. Modi is a strong, muscular leader, but he recognizes, I believe, again, it's my view, that he cannot run the country the same way he ran Gujarat. He can only run this country if he builds a consensus. You know, Gujarat was one thing. Running the state itself was one thing. Running 28 states and being re-elected is another. After all, he only won 38% of the seats. Of the votes. Okay? And the BJP only got 31 of those 38. 7% were the allies. Now that is still, he loses his charm. He fails to deliver. The voters are pretty ruthless. So I think he recognizes and he appreciates the bounds of democratic governance. Let's hope that is the case.
Vikram, thanks. We're going to take two more questions, and then our speaker, who must be getting very thirsty, needs to be refreshed. The gentleman at the back, yes, sir.
My name is Michael. I'm an entrepreneur. So I'm oil and gas entrepreneur. So I'm wondering what's the current challenges that the oil and gas industry in India is facing right now, and also the entrepreneur industry.
Oil and gas industry, yes. Okay. Another question? Anybody? Yes.
4.
So we've talked about how GDP at 8.5%, circa 8%, has gone down to 4.6, and a big part of this is because of the draconian legislation against MPs. I know you don't see a seismic shift, seismic change occurring anytime soon, but do you think with the hundreds of billions of dollars that are in stasis from infrastructure spending because of this law, with the repeal of it, we'll see a GDP bump in FY15, FY16?
Because it would be rude not. If you have ladies first, you have ladies last. We'll give you the last question.
That's April also.
Who?
No, both of them.
All right, okay.
I can't let you.
Katie from the Scottish Government. You mentioned that Modi didn't play a lot on religion in his campaign, but my question is, given that it's a Hindu national party now, what does what does it mean for people of other religions in
good
India,
question.
and will his government have an impact on will there be a kind of rise in religious things?
If you could remember 4 questions.
Yeah. Well,
Yes.
Okay, one more. April Gow, World Policy Institute, New York. Inward investment into India, with people like Warren Buffett pulling out, and you mentioned that the stock exchange was the fastest growing stock exchange. So how does that figure? And with the sort of clamping down on corruption, will Western companies come back, quickly? Will they respond quickly, do you think?
Yeah. Oil and gas. Oil and gas investment has stagnated over the last few years, part because the pricing structure of oil and gas has been misaligned, and part because the tax regime that had earlier been instituted got tightened against the interest of the oil and gas sector, and part because of the, you might say, paralysis, the policy paralysis in the government. It's never going to be easy to attract oil and gas investors into India because the geology of India is not like the geology of Kuwait or Saudi Arabia. That said, there have been some very significant finds in this part of India, and most of them have been deep waters, very complex geology. So I know from my own experience that given the right sort of incentives and the right framework, the international industry would look more seriously towards India. So I do believe that the government, and I actually not do believe, I know, because I'm also part of that committee, by the way, that is looking very quickly, and we're presenting a report, in fact, in 2 weeks' time, on what can be done to change the rules of the game to attract investment back into oil and gas exploration, both onshore and offshore. For entrepreneurs, I think the entrepreneurs, well, if you're a big-time entrepreneur, well, that's where you go. But if you have to have deep pockets, so I'm not sure what you mean by entrepreneurs. The Cairn Petroleum, your own company, where Bill Gamble was an entrepreneur. And in fact, the biggest mistake Shell made was to sell them the Rajasthan block. Okay? And I have to say that it's a historic blunder, because that block, was sold for all of $14 million, and he resold it. Well, he didn't, but Cairn resold it to Vedanta 2 years ago for $9 billion. All right? And they've just applied to increase their production from 200,000 barrels a day to 300,000 barrels a day. All right? So there are entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs. You'll get a Bill Gamble who will come in, or that kind of person, if you have the right sort of flexible policy. And then you'll have a Shell or a BP who will also be coming in. I think that is going to be the approach. So I'm optimistic. I'm not going to say to you that it's going to be a sea change overnight, because there are lots of there are more strong vested interests in this sector than perhaps in many other sectors, and you have to fight them all the time. So let's see. But if you don't get them in, we're in deep trouble by then, because we can't do it on our own. All right. No, there's a second question. Yeah, there. Sorry, just repeat.
Yeah,
I know that. Just give me the hint of the question.
Hundreds of billions
Yeah.
of dollars in infrastructure spending that have actually gone through, and half of the projects are completed. But because of this, they've been held in stasis because of the legislation. So now that Modi's repealing it, won't this have a very strong impact on GDP?
Yeah, no. So we believe, we meaning sort of the think tank community and economists and whoever else you want to bring into this sort of world of academia. I mean, the world of sort of intellectuals, public intellectuals, that the GDP suffered by up to 2.5% to 3% because of the delays in according approvals. But there's because large projects, 200,000 crores rupees. Now that means that's $60 billion almost, or so $30 billion worth of projects, $1 billion were held up because the government just did not give them the approvals. Now, the government then set up a committee called the Cabinet Committee on Investment. They set it up 6 months before the elections, and they tried their best to unclog these, but it was too late. But the fact is that they did start the process, and I think that process will continue. So give them credit for having started it, discredit for having got us into this problem, but credit at least for recognizing it and getting starting the process of unraveling the problem. This government, at least now, can build on that momentum. So you can see an increase in the GDP on account of this, but not in the short term. Today, growth is 4.5%, 4.6. At most, I think you will see in fiscal year 2014-15 a growth of 5.5% to 6%. Maybe 15-16, it'll go up to 6.2, 6.3%. It won't be till sort of 2017-18 that we are going to touch 7%. It's going to be very difficult to get to 8% in the first 5 years of his term. But even if you go to 7%, you are beginning to generate jobs. And that's the key for his re-election. Because there's millions of people that we're talking about need jobs, okay? That's the key. And Now, the third one was the, yeah, the hint is just a
Yes.
hint. I'm sorry, I'll let you.
Yeah, it was what does Modi's when
Yeah.
really mean for your people?
Religion. That's that you see, this is again, I mean, a question that I worry about also. One statistic: there is not a single Muslim member of parliament in the BJP. 282 members of parliament, not one Muslim. There are only 2 members of the minority community in the BJP, member of parliament. One Sikh and one Christian. So who is going to protect the minorities? Who is going to be actually looking at the issues of the minorities, which is your question? That is indeed a question. My hope, all our hope, is that Modi will indeed actually recognize that he has been criticized, not by the Indians, but by the world community for his Hindutva agenda. And, you know, you may not talk about Godhra, this awful incident that took place in 2002 where the Muslims were burnt, you know. You will not talk about it now, but you won't forget about it. And if there was one incident of communal rioting in India, that then could be sort of, you know, where the finger of blame could be pointed towards some government authority, you're going to be, a lot of people are going to suddenly get very nervous. So let me not answer the question, but leave the question back, return the question with a question. There is a concern, and the question is, who is going to look after the minorities? And the answer could be the minorities must look after themselves, they must actually become more cohesive, much more organized. The answer must be that the media must become more vigilant than they have been, and much more. The answer, hopefully, is that Modi himself recognizes that this is an issue that cannot be swept under the carpet. After all, we have 150 million Muslims and another 25 million non-Hindu, non-Muslims, right? And April, I am pretty, I think that as I said, the fundamentals of the Indian economy and the Indian polity are intact. If you were to fly on the boardroom of Shell or BP or Nokia or Microsoft or Walmart or Tesco, I think you'd probably find the conversation sort of moving in 2 different directions. Or there'd be a sort of paradoxical, there'd be a contradictory sort of tenor to the conversation. On one hand, people will be talking about all of these issues that have affected them adversely. You know, lack of contract sanctity, the retroactive tax rules, the bureaucracy, the red tape, the corruption, all those things that we have talked about, and which has been the bane of India's governance over the last 3 years. But on the other hand, everyone will be focused also on the fundamentals. You can't ignore an economy which has 600 million people, middle class. 300 right now, growing to 600, they say. You can't ignore the talent base that we have. You can't ignore the fact that if the government gets its policies right, you're likely to, you could very quickly establish a manufacturing position that would be competing, that could compete against the Chinese, because we have the low-cost labor. You can't ignore that, it's easier to deal with in an open, transparent, in a society that's open and transparent, and where the press is more vibrant, where the language is not an issue, where the people are more friendly or accessible. You just can't ignore that. And you have had success stories. There are a huge number of companies that have gone in there and made money. And you can't ignore also the fact that maybe now this government is indeed pro-business. This man is pro-business. He has actually run a state for 15 years, and where every single major company, both public and private, Indian and foreign, has actually established a presence, and successfully so. So I think the rules change, you will see FDI, that's foreign direct investment, come back into India, in spades. Foreign institutional investment has already started moving in. The reason the stock market is where it is today is because this number may be wrong, but I'm just going to say it, and then over the last 3 months, $280 billion of FII money has come into India. It may be last 6 months, but so I think no problem with that.
I think I'm going to be killed if I don't allow a particular gentleman to ask the final question, sir. If you could say who you are and your connections, please.
Mahendra Dal, founder of the Scottish Indian Arts Forum.
Dance Forum.
Scottish Arts Forum.
Arts Forum, wonderful. I think it's the same.
What do you think is the real solution for Modi to solve the problem like subsidies, which in my opinion is the real parasite in the economic development of India and has been ballooning, particularly in the last few years?
The nub of every politician's deepest dilemma is how do you provide affordable fuel, food to your electorate and at the same time prevent the fisc from going underwater. That's the big dilemma. Every democratic nation faces this dilemma. Every politician in a democratic country faces it. There is no exception. We are no exceptions. Modi is no exception. His predecessors were no exception. The challenge that Modi faces is, frankly, how do you reduce the subsidies on kerosene, LPG, food, and fertilizers? These are the 4 commodities that today account for the largest subsidies provided by the government. The answer to that is difficult, but if I was the Prime Minister and and I had a clean hand and I was an ideologue, I would essentially do 2 things. One is I would make sure that my target audience was very clearly identified. In other words, today I would have to give subsidies, there's no doubt. The poor of India cannot afford market-related prices, so they have to be subsidized. But today, much of the subsidies that we give don't reach the poor. They are actually received by you and me. I get subsidized LPG as much as the poorest of the poor. I can receive subsidized kerosene by using my clout to get it on the black market, or by making sure that it doesn't reach, the subsidized kerosene doesn't reach the. So first is to make sure that I have a very clear structure by which only those people who really deserve subsidies receive subsidies. So diesel prices are subsidized. I drive a diesel car. Why should I get subsidized diesel? I should be paying market-related price for diesel. So that's one. Make sure that if diesel prices or LPG prices or kerosene prices are subsidized, those subsidies only reach those people who deserve it. And that means you have to segment your market very much more clearly. But superimposed on that, you have to have a much more effective public distribution system. So you can't just say, here's a segment, here is a target audience, that's the group that's going to get it, if you don't also have a more efficient way of getting the subsidies to them. And that brings me to the real crux of the answer. You cannot provide subsidies through the companies that currently are the agents of subsidizations. You have to use technology to ensure that cash is transferred straight into the banks of your target audience. Now, we have this wonderful scheme called Aadhaar. I'm worried that the Aadhaar scheme may not be given, may not actually reach its full. Aadhaar is the unique identity, UID, unique identity D, what is that? Whatever. Anyway, unique identity system, which is essentially every human being in India has now or will be given an identity. And it's on the back of that identity that you actually can open your bank account and you have, you can receive money. Now, you need to use the platform of Aadhaar, which is based on technology, It was actually created by the founder of Infosys. And then transfer money from the central exchequer direct into the bank accounts of the poor and not have any intermediaries. Now, this will not mean that what will happen is that subsidies will exist, but you will have a more efficient utilization of subsidies, and it will also lead to the reduction of subsidies, because many of the subsidies that are currently given to the rich or the middle class will be taken out of the system.
You know there is a serious problem in implementation of the same system itself.
No, so improve that. I mean, no, the problems and problems and problems. As I said, for every single solution, you can find 50 problems. But this is maybe a final remark, an important remark. Don't throw out the good because of your quest for the great. You in India, if you think you're going to dot every I and cross every T, you're never going to get started even. All right? You won't get started. Make mistakes. The only way you're going to succeed in India, take the risk of taking that first step. And believe me, do not listen, I'm sorry to say this, but do not listen to everyone who brings out the problems. Find the correct solution. If you agree that this is the way to do it, start. There will be 100 reasons why, 100 problems with it. There will be leakages. But you will address them. But the cost of the current system is far greater than the cost of doing nothing. You have to do something. Okay? That's what I'm trying to do. Do something. Get the whole game now on the track. Back on track. What we have seen over the last 3 years is paralysis we've checked on ourselves into complete paralysis. And that's the biggest tragedy of the Indian economy. The opportunity cost has been huge.
Vikram, thank you.
Wow.